Somewhere over the North Atlantic, in the last week of January 1944, a six-engine German bomber was flying west. It was flying alone. It was flying farther from occupied Europe than any Luftwaffe aircraft had ever been sent. And if you believe account that later emerged, it was pointing straight at the coast of the United States. This is the story of the Junkers Ju 390, the Nazi plane that allegedly reached America, and whether it really did or whether the whole flight was invented in the years after the war is a mystery. Historians are still arguing about 82 years later. According to the post-war account, the aircraft turned back only when its crew could see the lights of New York in the distance. It then swung around, took the same route home, and landed in France without ever being spotted by American radar. If any of that is true, it was one of the most remarkable flights of the entire war. And, if none of it is true, it is one of the most persistent aviation myths ever produced. To understand which one it is, you have to go back 2 full years to the spring of 1942. Germany was still winning the war then. The Luftwaffe was flying deep into Soviet territory. Rommel was advancing across North Africa. And, in Berlin, Hermann Göring's staff was reading intelligence reports that made them uneasy in a completely different way. The reports were about American industry, about Detroit factories retooling for war, about shipyards on both American coasts putting out vessels faster than the U-boats could sink them. Germany, the reports warned, could not outproduce the United States. So Germany would have to hit the United States directly. In the spring of 1942, the Reich Air Ministry issued a request to Germany's aircraft manufacturers for a long-range heavy bomber capable of reaching the American mainland from Fortress Europe. The program was called the Amerika Bomber Project, and the design that came closest to actually flying was submitted by Junkers at Dessau. The engineers at Junkers did not start from a blank sheet. They started from an existing 4-engine transport aircraft, the Junkers Ju 290, which was already in Luftwaffe service. They kept its fuselage design. They stretched the wings. They added 2 more engines. And they extended the body to carry the fuel, and the payload is a transatlantic mission would demand. The result was a 6-engine giant, 6 BMW 800 and 1D radial engines, each producing 1,730 horsepower, a wingspan of 165 feet, a top speed of 314 miles per hour, faster than most Allied bombers of the day and comparable to some fighters, a service ceiling of 19,700 feet, and, on paper, a range of 6,030 miles, enough to fly from northern France, across the Atlantic, over the American coast, and back to Europe. The first prototype was designated the V-1. It made its maiden flight from Dessau on the 20th of October, 1943. The Air Ministry was impressed, so impressed, that within weeks it placed an order for 26 additional aircraft, and on the 26th of November, 1943, the Ju 390 V-1 was flown to Insterburg in East Prussia and shown personally to Adolf Hitler. Hitler saw it standing on the runway alongside a lineup of new prototypes, the wonder weapons the Reich was staking its survival on. He was told what it could do. He was told it could reach America. Whether he ordered a mission that day or simply approved further testing, no surviving document confirms. But what happened in the following weeks would become the foundation of one of the strangest and most disputed aviation stories of the entire war. The Ju 390 V-1, according to the logbook of its test pilot, was moved from Insterburg to Prague. Its test pilot was a Junkers veteran named Hans Joachim Pankers. Under Pankers, the aircraft conducted a series of long-range flights over the winter of 1943 into early 1944. These flights included tests of aerial, refueling a technology that in 1944 was still experimental in Germany, and one that would only make sense to develop for a mission of extreme range. By early 1944, the Ju-390 had proven it could stay in the air for many hours at a stretch. And this is where the story leaves the world of documented flight logs and enters the world of interrogation reports, rumor, and post-war journalism. In January of 1944, according to the account that would later spread through the aviation press, the Ju-390V1 was flown to Mont-de-Marsan, an airbase in southwestern France that was serving as a long-range reconnaissance hub for the Luftwaffe. From Mont-de-Marsan, still according to that account, the aircraft took off on a westward course out over the Bay of Biscay and into the open Atlantic. It flew for hours. It crossed the ocean without incident. It approached the American coast, and it turned around within roughly 12 miles of Long Island, New York, having reportedly photographed the coastline before beginning the long return flight to occupied France. Nobody in the United States saw it. Nobody shot at it. Nobody, if this account is true, even knew it had been there until months later, when the story began to leak out of a very different place. That place was an Allied interrogation room. In the summer of 1944, British and American intelligence officers were interrogating captured Luftwaffe personnel across newly liberated France. One of those prisoners was a photographic technician named Wolf Baumgart, whose unit had been stationed at Mont-de-Marsan, Baumgart's. Interrogation was recorded in a formal document, APWIU Report 44 of 1945. And in that report, according to later researchers, Baumgart described a long-range flight by a large German aircraft from Mont-de-Marsan in January of 1944 on a westward course that took it close to the coast of the United States. It was the first time Allied intelligence had heard the story. It would not be the last. For 11 years, the account sat inside classified files and intelligence archives. Then, in November of 1955, an aviation writer named Kenneth Werrell submitted a best-work letter to a British magazine called RAF Flying Review, whose editorial staff included the widely respected aviation historian William Green. Werrell's letter claimed to be based on an Allied intelligence report he had access to, and it stated that 2 Ju-390 aircraft had flown from occupied France to within sight of New York, remained in the vicinity of the city for approximately 1 hour, photographed it, and returned to Europe. The magazine published the letter but flagged it as extraordinary and requested corroboration. In March of 1956, a second letter arrived from a serving Royal Air Force officer correcting the account. There was only one aircraft. The second letter said not two, but the flight itself, the officer wrote, had happened. The story then went quiet for another 13 years. And then, in September of 1969, London's Daily Telegraph published an article titled "The Lone Bomber Raid on New York Planned by Hitler." The article was built around a new source, Hans Joachim Pankers himself, the Junkers test pilot. Pankers, then in his 60s, told the Telegraph that in early 1944, he had personally flown a Ju-390 on a long-range mission that took the aircraft from Germany to Cape Town in South Africa as a preparatory endurance run for a later mission across the Atlantic to the United States. Pankers confirmed the general outline of the story, and, with a first-hand named witness now on the record, the account moved out of the intelligence archives and into the Mainstream of aviation history. William Green cited ITN, his 1968 book, Warplanes of the Second World War. He cited it again in his 1970 follow-up, Warplanes of the Third Reich. For a decade, the Ju-390's flight to America was treated by serious historians as at least plausible, and by many enthusiasts as a matter of settled record. And then, in 1980, Hans-Joachim Panchers gave another interview, and in this one, he denied it. Panchers stated that the only Ju-390 that had ever flown was the V-1 prototype. He said no operational Ju-390 had ever been sent across the Atlantic. He cast doubt on every claim that had been made about a flight to the vicinity of New York, including the claims that had been attributed to him personally in 1969. What exactly happened between the Daily Telegraph interview and the 1980 denial? No historian has ever fully explained. But Panchers's retraction cracked the story wide open. And once researchers began looking closely at the flight, they found a series of problems that no version of the account could fully answer. There was the fuel problem. A round trip from Mont de Marsan to Long Island would have consumed nearly every drop the Ju-390 could carry at a moment when the Reich was rationing aviation fuel by the liter. There was the radar problem. American East Coast air defenses in January of 1944 were extensive, and a large six-engine unknown aircraft crossing that coast should have generated a paper trail on the American side. It never did. There was the payload problem. The aircraft flew empty. So what exactly was the mission for? And there was the documentation problem. No Luftwaffe operational order for the flight has ever been found in the surviving German archives. But the story is not so easy to dismiss either, because the Ju-390 V-1 did exist. It did fly. It was displayed to Hitler at Insterburg on the 26th of November, 1943. The Reich Air Ministry did order 26 additional aircraft. Aerial refueling tests were conducted, and there is no innocent reason to conduct aerial refueling tests on a six-engine bomber unless someone is planning an extreme-range mission, and Wolf Baumgart's interrogation, which predates every post-war publication by more than a decade, did happen. A photographic technician stationed at the exact airfield the flight is said to have launched from told his captors in the summer of 1944, before any publication, before any rumor that a large German aircraft had flown west from that base on a very long mission. The Ju-390 program did not survive the year the alleged flight took place, on the 20th of June, 1944, exactly 2 weeks after Allied troops landed in Normandy. The Luftwaffe Quartermaster General canceled the contract for the 26 additional aircraft. By September of 1944, all Ju-390 production had ceased. The V-1 prototype was flown back to Dessau. It sat there through the winter. In late April of 1945, as American troops approached the city, it was stripped of usable parts and destroyed on the ground. A second prototype, the V-2, may or may not have been completed. One test pilot, Oberleutnant Joachim Isermann, is said to have flown it briefly at Rechlin Air Base on the 9th of February, 1945. Other sources insist the V-2 never flew at all. Even the basic question of how many Ju-390s ever existed remains disputed. What survives is the story, and the story, whatever the truth of it, tells you something real about the last 2 years of Nazi Germany. It tells you about a regime that had lost ability to distinguish between the possible and the impossible. It tells you about engineers who were still designing intercontinental bombers in 1943 while the bombers' Eastern Front was collapsing behind them. It tells you about a leadership that spent Germany's dwindling industrial capacity on a plane meant to bomb New York at a moment when it could no longer defend its own cities from being bombed, whether or not a Ju-390 ever actually flew within 12 miles of Long Island. The fact that Reich was capable of planning such a flight and building the aircraft to attempt it is, itself, the more important story. And it is a story historians will still be arguing about long after the debate over the flight is settled. So the question is yours. Do you believe the Ju-390 really reached America in January of 1944? Or do you think the whole thing was a rumor that took on a life of its own after the war? Drop your verdict in the comments. I read every one. If this video helped you understand the mystery, hit the like button because it tells the algorithm to show this story to more people who care about the untold history of the Second World War. And subscribe because the Ju-390 was not the only aircraft Hitler ordered built to strike America. There was another, designed by Willy Messerschmitt himself, with a range so extreme that its own engineers were not sure it could survive the return flight. Next time, the plane Hitler personally chose to bomb New York. Thanks for watching.